America is a car culture. We have been ever since Henry Ford produced the Model T in 1908 and paid his workers $5 a day. In 2021 dollars, that would be $130 a day. With that one act, Henry Ford began America's love affair with the automobile and a new phrase entered the American lexicon: road trip. Today we think nothing of throwing a bag in the car and heading out somewhere for the weekend or a week. It could be 100 miles, it could be 500 miles away. We can stop anywhere and have lunch: McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's. And for those of us with a more sophisticated palate, there are the fine dining establishments, such as Golden Corral and Sonny's. If the trip takes a day or two, no problem. Plenty of places to stop and rent a room. It doesn't matter the distance. Our car will get us there. We all have one great road trip that we remember. There is one road trip that beats all others. The first road trip ever was 3,251 miles long, and it happened 102 years ago during the summer of 1919, in the middle of the Spanish flu pandemic. Now, it wasn't a bunch of college kids loaded up with beer and junk food during this road trip. It was the United States Army, the famous 1919 Transcontinental Motor Convoy. Understanding the strategic importance of a national road network across the country, the Army decided to send a motor transport convoy from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, California in the summer of 1919. The convoy would use the Lincoln Highway, the only transcontinental highway at that time, and to call it a highway was being generous. In his report of the convoy's expedition, Adjutant and Statistical Officer for the expedition, Captain William C. Graney, stated, "The Lincoln Highway at that time existed largely in the imagination or on paper." Now the road was continuous. It was paved in some areas, dirt in other areas, and a lot of mud and sand in the western part of the country. Obviously, these guys did not have the comforts of traveling we have today. The convoy was going to find out just how good or bad the Transcontinental Highway was. The other goals of the convoy were to evaluate the vehicles and equipment the Army would be using in the field, recruitment of men, and the logistical problems associated with moving an army across a continent. And finally, the Army wanted to show the people just what their Liberty Bonds paid for that they bought during the war. The convoy consisted of 24 expeditionary officers, 15 War Department staff observation officers, 258 enlisted men, along with civilian technicians from the various automobile manufacturers and suppliers. There were 79 specialized military vehicles from the main manufacturers of the time. There was the White, FWD, Cadillac, Packard, Riker, Dodge, Mack, GMC, Harley-Davidson, and Indian, and the Class B standard 3-ton Liberty truck, which was produced by the Army during World War I. 34 heavy cargo trucks, 4 light delivery trucks, 2 mobile machine shops, 1 mobile blacksmith shop, 1 wrecking truck, 2 spare parts store trucks, 2 mobile water tanks, 1 mobile gas tank, 1 searchlight truck, a Caterpillar tractor, 4 kitchen trailers, 8 touring cars, 1 reconnaissance car, 2 staff observation cars, 5 car-side motorcycles, and 4 solo motorcycles. And in command of this convoy was Lieutenant Colonel Charles W. McClure. He was only appointed 3 days earlier by Brigadier General Charles B. Drake, Chief of the Motor Transport Corps. I would like to have been in on that conversation when he was giving the orders. The convoy was supplied and scheduled to leave Camp Meigis, Washington, D.C. on July 7, 1919 at 8:30 a.m. The first stop was the Ellipse in Potomac Park, Washington, D.C. The convoy pulled out of Camp Meigis on time. It was over 2 miles long. The first stop, like I said, was the Ellipse by the White House. By the time the first trucks were parking at the White House, the tail end of the convoy was just leaving Camp Meigis. The ceremony at the Ellipse was attended by Washington dignitaries and industry businessmen such as Harvey Firestone and Frank Sieberling of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. Secretary of War Newton Baker gave a commemorative speech, the most notable and prophetic line being, "This is the beginning of a new age." And with that, he unveiled the 0 milestone marker with the inscription "Starting Point" of the first transcontinental motor convoy over the Lincoln Highway, 7 July 1919. And with that send-off, Colonel McClure and his expedition departed Washington at 11:15 a.m. First stop, Rockville, Maryland for lunch. Almost immediately, problems occurred. The trio mobile kitchens broke a coupling, and by 2:50 p.m., the white observation car broke its fan belt. The giant Militor had to tow the Class B 3-ton military truck, with the broken magneto into the fairgrounds in Fredericksburg, Maryland. The convoy traveled 46 miles in 7.5 hours. They arrived at camp at 6:30 p.m. Lieutenant Jackson kept a daily log of the expedition, noted the roads were excellent. The weather was fair and warm. That first day's mechanical issues were minor and few compared to what they would encounter over the next 2 months. Every day of the expedition, the convoy would encounter a myriad of mechanical problems, from the minor problems such as a broken fan belt, broken brackets, fouled spark plugs, carburetors being fouled or needing adjusting or cleaning, tires punctured, and to the major breakdowns and accidents due to the inexperience of the Army personnel driving these vehicles and their lack of training. There would be vehicle rollovers, universal joints breaking, connecting rods shearing, cylinders blowing out, radiators being punctured, and through it all, the maintenance company kept that convoy rolling. If they could not get a vehicle running with a roadside repair, there was the Militor 3-ton wrecker, winch and tractor, designed to carry large artillery guns, and in his report, Lieutenant Jackson stated, the artillery wheeled tractor, or Militor as it is popularly known, was unquestionably the most valuable vehicle in the entire convoy, and as a wrecker, for which purpose it was chiefly used, it served with distinction. On the road, the Militor always brought up the rear of the train and rescued any vehicle that had gone into the ditch or took in tow those that were disabled. Hardly a day passed without the Militor doing some towing. Lieutenant Colonel McClure was given a very specific timetable, and he was determined to stick to it. And to maintain this schedule, a well-organized order of march, as the Army says, was followed. First part of the convoy to head out each day was the publicity officer and the recruiting officer. They were usually a day or two ahead of the convoy. In his report, Lieutenant Jackson, less than enthusiastic about their work. Quote, the work of the publicity officer, Lieutenant William Doran, is preparing the people along the route for the arrival of the convoy was, in a large measure, counteracted by the exaggerated and misleading statements which he issued or permitted to be issued through the public press. And it is to be regretted that after having read the newspaper accounts of the convoy, the people of many communities were somewhat disappointed when the train of trucks arrived. Hopefully, Lieutenant Doran found a job on Madison Avenue, because with that kind of endorsement, Dorn's Army career basically ground to a halt. But to be fair to Dorn, the convoy had a civilian public relations tagging along with the convoy, and that person was representing the automobile interests and the Building Good Roads Association. And it was most likely this person hyped the convoy. Now, Colonel William T. Carpenter, the observer for the Coast Artillery Corps, stated in his report on the order of march, 2 officers who served as guides preceded the convoy by a few hours. Each rode a solo motorcycle the entire distance. They determined the route and examined the roads carefully and put up direction markers at crossroads, turns, and other places where the convoy might go astray. Lieutenant Jackson explained in detail how these markers worked. The markers consisted of solid-colored paper isosceles triangles, 11 inches at the base and 5.5 inches altitude, which were tacked on conspicuous posts or fence at each turn of the road or intersection. When the apex of the triangle pointed up, indicated the route was straight ahead. Apex pointed to the right, indicated a right turn. Apex to the left, left turn. And when 2 triangles tacked up base to base, thus forming a square, indicated the location of the campsite. Without these markers, considerable difficulty would have been experienced in following the route through the cities and through the detours. He further stated that the engineers preceded the main column by a few hours, or in some cases a day, to inspect the roads, bridges, and crossings to make sure such repairs as were needed. The interesting part of the road repair was that the state highway departments would supply the engineers with tools and materials to make the repairs, a foreshadowing of federal highway assistance, obviously. Now, along with the engineers, the mess trucks and the kitchen trailers headed out to a predetermined point. This way they could have the meals ready for the men. There were times during this trek that meals were missed due to serious delays encountered by the main body of the convoy. Now, another cause of meals being delayed or missed entirely was the inadequacy of the mobile kitchen trailers. Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower stated, kitchen trailers were of the 2- and 4-wheel type. Now, in my opinion, neither is suitable for transport work, and a better one must be devised. The design of the trailers made it impossible for the cook for the cooks to make soup or boil coffee while on the move. By the time the column stopped, half the soup or coffee would have been spilled out. So, they had to start from scratch. About 2 hours after the guards left the camp, the main body of the convoy moved out. Now, the various vehicles in the convoy made efficient travel difficult. Colonel Eisenhower noted in his report, each type of vehicle had, quote, its own most efficient speed rate, causing great difficulty in keeping the trucks properly closed in the convoy formation. This caused a great deal of problems during the trip due to the road conditions along the route, as well as spreading the formation out over many miles. Now, the convoy followed the Lincoln Highway as stated, which passed through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and California. Colonel Eisenhower noted in his report about the road conditions as far as Indiana being very good and paved most of the way. Only major problem being that the covered bridges were too low and had to be altered, and the roads in some places were too narrow. This required vehicles to drive half on the road and half off the road to accommodate oncoming vehicles. Once the convoy reached Illinois, he stated, "In Illinois, we started on dirt roads and practically no pavement was encountered until reaching California." Besides the mechanical problems encountered every day, the biggest problem faced by the convoy was the road itself and the inexperience of the drivers. As stated previously, in the eastern part of the country, the roads were fairly decent. It was the covered bridges that gave the convoy headaches. The roofs of the bridges were too low for the trucks to pass through or under. Now, the engineers had to take down parts of the bridge so the trucks could get through the covered area. Out west, it was the dirt rot. It was the dry rot that caused the bridges to fail. Then the engineers would have to repair or rebuild the bridge. Trucks would break through culverts, causing linkage couplings and universal joints to break. And in the Midwest, the road could turn to gumbo, a thick, viscous form of mud that would cause the trucks and cars to sink up to their hubs. The dust and sand encountered on the dirt roads would clog gearboxes, carburetors. Every day there was a multitude of mishaps and breakdowns. The necessity of roadside repairs, or in some cases, towing the vehicle into camp where the mechanics would complete the repairs. This could take all night in some cases. A number of the mechanical problems and road accidents could have been avoided if the convoy had experienced drivers. The majority of the enlisted men were raw recruits who volunteered because they said they could drive a car. However, they could not drive a truck. One mechanic related how one of the drivers was constantly stalling and breaking down. When he finally rode with the driver to see what the problem was with the truck, he realized the driver did not know how a clutch worked. The driver was using the brakes to shift gears, which caused the truck to stall naturally. The driver had to get out and hand crank that vehicle. He was exhausted. But the indispensable vehicle, as said before, and man as well on this road trip, was the Militor. And the man who drove it, Sergeant First Class T.E. Woods, Jr. On July 15th, while towing a number of vehicles, Sergeant Wood drove from 8 a.m. that morning until 2:50 a.m. the next day without sleep or food. No one thought to send food back to him. And on August 3rd, Sergeant Wood in the Militor towed every truck in the convoy at least once. And at one point, the Militor had 9 trucks chained together and was able to handle the load without a problem and pull them through. Jackson noted in his report, but for that tractor's ability to pull heavy loads through deep mud or sand, most of the larger trucks in the convoy would never have reached San Francisco. They used it a lot to get up over the high-graded hills. Now, every night when the convoy encamped, every nut, bolt, linkage, tire, spark plug, and carburetor were cleaned and checked. On Sundays, which was a non-travel day, all the trucks were cleaned, oiled, lubed. Basic maintenance was performed, along with any major repairs that needed to be completed. Jackson noted in his final report, each Sunday morning in camp was spent in examining radiators, crankcases, transmissions, differential housings, wheel bearings, etc., cleaning them out and refilling them with the proper lubricant whenever necessary. The convoy traveled every kind of terrain imaginable, from the mountains and rolling hills and ridges of Pennsylvania, crossing the Mississippi and the Missouri River, through the prairies of the Midwest, and into the salt flats and deserts crossing the Continental Divide. They were negotiating the dangers of the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada mountain range on roads that were nothing more than trails made by early settlers in some areas. Despite the hardships and long hours, the men on the convoy were treated well by the communities where they encamped for the night. The camps were open to the local population to visit. Local dignitaries and clubs would put on barbecues and dances for the men, while the officers were invited to dine at local clubs. While passing through Akron, Ohio, the whole convoy was invited by Harvey Firestone to his farm in Columbiana for a big fried chicken dinner. The men were treated as celebrities. One man, Private Fred Golick, met a girl on Tuesday. She followed the convoy into Columbus, Ohio, and that Sunday they were married. Right. Now, over the course of the 3,251-mile, 11-state road trip, the engineers repaired 88 bridges and culverts, had 230 road accidents, such as going off the road or rolling over an embankment, sinking in quicksand or mud, and the vehicle turnovers. 3 times the convoy was forced to stop due to quicksand. All officers and men jumped in at that point to rescue the entire convoy from a complete disaster that would have ended the journey right there. The living conditions weren't that great out west. Now, the living conditions of the personnel were rugged, Lieutenant Colonel McClure stated. The average amount of sleep was limited to 5.5 hours per day. The work was continuous and strenuous, coupled with a lack of shelter, bad rations, lack of bathing facilities, and sometimes a scarcity of drinking water took its toll on the men. He went on to say the environmental conditions posed hardships as well. The alternating extremes of temperatures, rain, high winds, excessive dust and storms, and the dry atmosphere of the arid western regions combined to make conditions extremely difficult on the morale of the men. Now, on September 6, 1919, the convoy arrived at the destination of the Presidio Army Base in San Francisco, California. Lieutenant Ewell Jackson noted in his daily log, weather fair and warm. Paved city streets made 8 miles in 3 hours. Arrived in San Francisco, California, 11:30 a.m. Now, the benefits and lessons learned from this convoy would be put to good use when the United States went to war in 1941. It was able to go to war as a mechanized army. But the biggest benefit, however, was when Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower became President Eisenhower, January 1953. His experience from the convoy made him realize the need for an interstate highway system. And on June 29, 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act was passed in Congress. Over the next 36 years, 2.7 million miles of paved road were completed at an estimated $425 billion. That's about $5 billion today. Construction of the interstate highway system was officially declared complete in 1992. That was the best road trip ever, and it's our history, it's our heritage. I'd like to thank you for watching. Now, if you like this video, hit the subscribe button. I'll be posting new videos every 2 weeks. I'd like to do this every week, but I don't think I'm going to give up my day job. I don't think it'd be a smart idea.